back with the floating art frame. After getting all the pieces of wood dimensioned, we can finally start with cutting these pieces into miters and doing the joinery to fitting this frame together. As you can see here, the backing I had mentioned before, this is what the little piece standing up is what the art itself will be able to screw to inside of the frame. And the piece of art that's screwed in there will look like it's floating. So the first thing I had to do was cut the miters for the frame. I've had to do extensive testing with that miter saw to make sure that these miters are perfectly 45. Very hard to get miters to fit nicely if your saw is not straight. So in the process of designing this, I was a little concerned with the length of the sides of the art frame. I think they're 40 inches long. I was concerned that the splines wouldn't be strong enough by themselves to make the miter joint a strong enough joint. So I decided to add a feature in these backings that are going to hold the art frame, and cutting some joinery where the corners will be half lapped and have a small section protruding into the side of the frame itself, which I'll show you here in a second. So I spent some time cutting these joints and then making them really accurate with these chisels on our lines that will make sure when the joints fitted, everything comes together nicely. Takes a little time, but it's worth the extra effort to get a more precise joint. To ensure the two pieces come together, that half lap has to be exactly half the depth of each piece, so that when they come together, they're flush on either side. You got to make sure you get all the way into those corners, because if there's any little bit of fibers there, it'll create a gap that's noticeable. So here's that joint coming together. You can see the half lap, and you can see the little protrusion there I was talking about. That's gonna fit into the frame and have a little bit of extra glue surface where all of the pieces tie together. And you can see here I'm cutting the groove into the side of the frame to accept that protrusion. So my hope was that when I was done gluing up all of these pieces together, that would be a very, very strong joint there, especially for an art frame, where the customer wouldn't have to worry about this frame coming apart in the future, because handling a 40-inch frame tends to put a lot of strain on those corners, and so I wanted to make sure that it held together. If you haven't not seen one of these tools before, this is called a hand router. It's very useful. It has a little chisel on the bottom there that allows you to dial in the depth, so that when you run it along the bottom, it creates an exact depth and a consistent depth along the perpendicular face. It'll be that depth all the way, however long that gap is. And here's the joint coming together there, showing how it fits. I had to spend some time doing what's called a dry fit to make sure that I understood the ins and outs of clamping this up. This is, although it don't look like much, there's a lot to this glue up, and a lot of little pieces that once they're installed with the glue on them, they don't want to move very much. So I have to make sure I don't waste any time gluing this thing up and something not coming together correctly. So here we see I had to add some sort of support in the middle of this frame because I'm going to be handling it, cutting the splines. This is after it's glued up. Everything's been glued together, so I need to cut the splines in the edges. And a regular spline jig wouldn't work, so I had found, and mistakenly didn't video it, but I found a video on YouTube where this guy set up his table saw with the blade high enough where it created a 45-degree angle, and then all you had to do was slide your box face down at the right dimension from the fence and go the exact depth to where the spline was cut. And again, I wish I had videoed it, but for some reason I was too engrossed in the process to remember to turn the video on. So I went ahead and created my splines, and here you can see the splines are, the gaps are cut for the splines in the corners of the frame, and preparing for glue up. And although I realized that my filming is not that great right now, I have plans. I don't have the equipment I need to do a better job with these videos, but I have plans on making that happen. I really hope to get some good angles where you guys can see exactly what's going on here. Gluing in splines is pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of getting enough glue in there to make sure that all the gaps are filled, so that whenever the splines come together with the frame, it makes a really strong connection. And then, you have the leftover part there that you gotta trim off. I'm trimming it a little higher than where it needs to be, so that I can come back with my hand plane and plane everything perfectly flush. I also added a little bit of a tape here to make sure I don't scar up the face of the frame while I'm trimming these splines off. And here's where the hand planes really come in handy. They make a perfectly flat surface with the combination of the two woods coming together. You can hand plane them with a really sharp blade to where you can't even hardly tell that there's two different pieces of wood as far as the surface goes. It makes a really nice flush joint there. Well, now is the fun part is the finishing. I enjoy finishing because you can start seeing the colors in the wood pop, grain in the wood. But a lot of effort goes in making sure while building the piece that everything's smooth and sanded nicely, because when you put on the finish, as I'm sure many of you know, the issues come out. You can see them when you put the finish on. And so for me, I'm using a wipe-on tung oil finish, and I like to put it on in very light coats. So I'll put on the first coat, I'll sand down any high spots, shiny spots, anything like that. And then I'll come back, I'll put on a second coat, just wiping it on lightly. And with this finish, after you wipe it on, you give it a little bit of time to dry, 5-10 minutes, and you wipe off the excess. If you don't, you'll have lots of thick spots where it may have puddled or drained to or whatever, and it makes it really difficult to get a smooth surface. So even though it takes much longer, you go back and wipe the excess off to make sure you don't have those problems. And yes, it does wipe off some of the finish, but if you keep adding layers, you'll build up that finish to where it's a nice protective finish, but you don't actually see, it doesn't look like a finish. It looks like the wood is still bare and beautiful. And also the sanding, you got to be really light with the sanding to make sure you're not taking off too much of the finish. You're taking off some, but what you're doing is leveling it out to make sure it's smooth. Sometimes little dust particles and that sort of thing lands on it when it's drying, and sanding it removes those as well. And it's really helpful to take a bright light, and look for those places where there might be a shiny spot or a dust nib somewhere on the finish, or something you might have missed or whatever. The light, brings it all out. It makes it stand out. You can't miss it with the light. So I continue with adding the layers of finish. I think I did like 5 layers, and each sanding in between layers is progressively less aggressive. So, I start out with 220, go down to 400, and eventually down to steel wool. And then the very last sanding, if you will, is done with a brown paper bag material. It's got very little abrasive texture to it, but it does knock off any kind of dust, that sort of thing, where your finish turns out just beautiful, flat, and just looks like it's nothing but wood. You can hardly even tell there's a finish on it. But obviously after 5 coats, there is a finish on it that will protect it from any issues in the future, as far as something getting spilled on it or anything like that. It'll protect it. Here's me going over it with the steel wool I mentioned earlier. Very, very light, going over just to make sure there's nothing sticking up, protruding like wood fibers or dust nibs, or maybe even some of my cloth, little nibs from the cloth on there, that might stick to the to finish when it's drying. And as I mentioned before, I use the brown paper bag just to touch up after the last coat, make sure everything's even and smooth, and here's the end result. I also offer some engraving features. Some people request certain scriptures, so I'll put them on there inside of the frame for them. I hope you enjoyed watching this process and seeing how a floating art frame is made. Please feel free to add some comments down below. See you next time.